Charlene, you're muted.
My name is Charlene Eigen-Vasquez, and I will do another, a better introduction in a minute. But I wanted to, well, I'll let you know that I'm here in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a member of the Ohlone Nation, and I wanted to offer you a prayer to the four directions before we begin. Creator, I humbly sit before you and call in the four directions so that we are able to listen and see and pay attention during this time of learning, that we all take from it what we need and that we share what we need to those that are outside of us that couldn't make it here today. So to the north is a place of the winter. It is a place of mental health and wellness. North is the home of the old ones and those gone by. To the ancestors, the elders, the grandparents of all living beings, we ask for guidance. North is a place of wisdom. North is the direction of the cold, of the winds, the strength, courage, fortitude, might, focus, and purpose. North takes us to the mountaintops, a place of clarity, foresight, communion with all that exists. North reminds us to be humble and to be generous. We invite the spirits of the North to join us in community for this discussion. To the east is the place of the spring. East is the place of spiritual health. The east represents fire. East is where the sun rises. East represents new beginnings, hope, promise, and potential. To the east, we pray for our babies and those to come. We invite the wind that reminds us of the awakening of life. May our eyes be lifted to see the freedom of the birds. May our thoughts be in awareness of the gifts before us today. We invite the spirits from the east to join us in community for this discussion today. To the south, the place of summer. South is the place of emotional health. South is the direction of Mother Earth. South is the direction of warmth, growth, and fertility. South brings us creativity and productivity. To the south, we find teachings of relationship, music, dance, art, and all those things that carry joy. South is the direction of our youth, those just making their way, those seeking knowledge, those collecting our stories. We look to the south for health, wellness, and harmony. We invite the spirits of the south to join us in community for this discussion today. And to the west, the place of autumn. West is the place of physical health, comfort, and security. West is the place where the sun sets. West is the place of rest. The place of the dream world, the place of closure and place of endings. Everything needs to happen in order to inspire new beginnings, of course. West is the adults who are paving the way for our future and future generations. To the water, to the sage, we invite spirits from the west to join us in community for this discussion today. Thank you for taking that moment so that we set our hearts right, so that we can walk in a good way, talk in a good way, and listen with all of our intention.
Oh.
The next thing I wanted to do was just to say a few things before we get started. As we speak, you might listen to like some ideas that would be helpful to your community, to your tribe. And what we want to say is, yes, indeed, we do provide a service, and sometimes it's for a fee, and sometimes it's, you know, we can waive the fee. But we also help tribes to raise money if services are going to be beneficial. And I think that sometimes that's something different that we offer that maybe other people that share information don't necessarily say straight out. But when we see a need, we do our best to raise some money to support services that tribes need. And we've done so in the past. And I would say that even this webinar here is subsidized by fees that we've raised to help support the work that tribes need or requests. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you're listening. And if you think you hear something that your tribe needs, and for whatever reason, like you don't have the resources, I come from a not federally recognized tribe, right? A recognized tribe, the state of California recognizes that, obviously our people do, and our relatives do. But that means that resources that come to us are very slim. We have to raise them ourselves. We have to earn them ourselves. We donate ourselves. So just think about those things as we share, and definitely like just circle back if there's something that you hear that you need more of, and you can contact probably Maija at her email address for more learnings, more teachings, or more guidance that you might hear about. Thank you. Maija?
As we do, my name is Maija West, and I'll do a more full introduction in a minute, but I'm calling in from Esalen-Rumson territory on the central coast of California, also known as Carmel Valley, California. And we have been collecting information from our Indigenous relatives through these gatherings and webinars this past year and last year to help us guide our direction and where we find ourselves to be speaking with the best and most beneficial assistance to those who attend, and also to guide our conversations with those that Indigenous nations must work in partnership with, such as the conservation community and land trusts and state and federal and local agencies. And so we invite you to complete this survey to help us, to support us in advocating for these needs through funding and other services we can provide. And so we'd like to just take a moment and invite you, if you haven't done so already, to complete this survey for about 2 minutes. It's been put in the chat window. Some of you might be on a phone, so you might have to copy it for later. But if you can fill it out now, we'll just take a moment here to get your feedback and input that will help us with our guidance today and what we speak of as well. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but I don't see, this is Deirdre, I don't see any survey in the chat, just a participant list.
Azure, is that something you can help with?
Yes, I just sent it to you through private message as well to see if that works.
Okay, Jessica just sent it to everyone. So let me know if you don't see it now. Thank you for the feedback, Deidre, appreciate it. Did you see it now?
I seen it in the chat, and I copy and paste it to my my browser, and it opened up to the survey. So just to let you know, I seen both of them actually.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. Deidre, are you? If you need additional assistance, will you message Hajer or Jessica? Okay, we've gotten some feedback that for some of the attendees, they've completed it. So we'll just take another few seconds here before we move forward to balance the different needs of this group. Charlene, when you're ready.
I think Charlene is muted there. I don't think she's going on a soliloquy.
Ta-da. So my name is Charlene Eigen-Vasquez. As I mentioned before, I'm a member of the, I'm a descendant of the Ohlone people. I come from the village of Chautauqua, which is just about 20 miles from the coast here in California. I am also of Mexican descent. My traditional territory, based on like the research that I've done, is from the San Francisco Bay Area all the way to the Carmel Valley. I'm dedicated to pretty much land back initiatives and land preservation. I've worked with people on land restoration. I will make my introduction pretty short, but pretty much besides land initiatives, I also do mediation work. So over the course of COVID shutdown, for example, I've been part of mediation meetings in areas where large protests have taken place. So like Maija and Andy, I also consider myself a peacemaker and have worked with in conversation with government to government on government to government challenges. So for example, between tribes and government entities on really hot topics. So I will kind of leave it at that. Maija?
I almost did the mute thing. Hi, my name is Maija West. I am of Latvian and German descent. I go by she, her. I'm also a mother and a wife. I grew up in Maija territory in northeastern California, and now I live in Esalen-Remsen territory here next to the Carmel River. My first name means goddess of the hearth and home, Latvian name that my mother gave me, and I take that job seriously now. I didn't when I was younger. I didn't wanted to be a goddess or a hearth of any home. And I now think of that as how I practice, which is to care for circle space as a peacemaker and mediator and a facilitator of healing and reconciliation when invited to do so by Indigenous leaders or nations in my community. I'm also a former attorney with 15 years of experience in nonprofit foundation and business governance. I'm one of the managing partners of Maija West Consulting and also one of the founders of the Healing and Reconciliation Institute, which is our sister affiliate in this work. Andy?
Thank you, Maija. Thank you, Charlene. My name is Andy Kull. I am coming to you from Wabanaki, the country, the land of the people of the dawn. Over here, we call it Maine, Brunswick, Maine, on the coast of Maine. I'm a lawyer. I've been a business and nonprofit attorney for almost 20 years, although I've pivoted the last few years and have moved more in the direction of peacemaking. I had the great good fortune to work and study with some of my Indigenous peacemaking mentors and others. And so as well as doing business individual consulting. And I've had the great good fortune also to do some land back work and also be on the board of Nabizin, which some of you are familiar with, is a Wabanaki-led nonprofit. And I'm not Wabanaki, I'm of mixed European ancestry. And I'm also a father and a husband. So thank you. Back to you. Or Maija, maybe.
Awesome. Yep. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Charlene. So we've been offering different focuses as part of our Indigenous governance and support series. And today we're going to be really focusing on governance support. And the topics we're going to cover include like kind of leadership transition plan. Charlene will be sharing some about, we're going to hear from Andy on real compliance and what matters and what doesn't. And then I'll be sharing some on relationships, specifically with an eye towards Indigenous peoples who are having to deal with non-Indigenous agencies or organizations. So I welcome Charlene to get us started in our conversation.
Thank you, Maija. So one of the things that I hope you're interested in is a leadership transition plan. And I think this is a really important topic for people that actually have an organized tribe that they're working with, or people that are just is not the right word, people that are on the ground working to defend very important things to their nation. And the reason is partly and mostly is sustainability. So what they say is cultural preservation and sustainable relationships are at the foundation of advancing the work of tribes today. So in a sense, if you think holistically about the role of a tribe and the goals of a tribe, what happens if a leader or the couple of leaders that seem to be doing all of the work, what if they disappear one day, or for whatever reason, you know, they can't continue their work? What happens? And you kind of see that if you look back in history and you think about the people that were doing work, you know, we'll just say, you know, at the turn of the century, we'll say 1920 or something like that. You know, that although people are working really hard today to preserve culture and to sustain language and to protect land, that's been happening for a really long time. And what happens is when those people are doing that really hard work, if they should pass on and there isn't anybody to pick up the work that they're doing, it goes numb for a little while. And that's kind of been the experience that I've seen after talking to a number of different tribes. It doesn't ever stop, it doesn't ever disappear, and somebody will pick it up later. But we'd rather not wait for a generation who cares enough to get back into it to continue the work. Instead, what we're thinking about today is, and what I'd like to talk to you about is, how do you keep that ball rolling? How do you make sure that your tribe is always moving in the forward direction, and all of the work that's been put in by people today continues? So there's a few things to think about. If you step away from, we'll just say, Euro government structures and think about traditional native structures, there are some really important components. And the important components include something like a strong elder circle. The elder circle really provides guidance to the leadership that is in place and some historical context to those people that are the decision makers. So something to think about, do you have a strong elder circle? And if not, is that something that you're interested or have thought about? Is that something that needs to be put in place to make sure that you have a strong leadership transition plan? And when I'd like to mention about an elder circle is that the role is really as consultants. They're people that you could go to and ask for advice. Some of the elder circle that I've seen aren't as engaging as you might hope. And what I mean is an elder circle might be created, but it's more of a place of retirement. And that's absolutely not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is really an active elder circle, keeping people that are advisors engaged, and a place for you to go to counsel when something important comes up. Because if you think about the relations you have just sitting in your chair right now, who are the people that you've actually been able to talk to in your life, and how far does that communication go? So for myself, for example, you know, I have myself, and before me, I have my mother who passed away, we'll say around 10 years ago. So we had a good relationship. Then my grandmother before her, and we had a good relationship. I don't know my grandmother before that, but my grandmother told me her story. So you think about all the communication that goes down the family tree when people have an elder circle and they can go back even 2 or 3 generations before themselves. So hopefully that makes sense. Without a diagram, it's a little bit hard to explain, but just think about all the generations before you, all the generations after you, and all of those generations should be represented in your leadership transition plan, even though you're talking about a particular leader, right? You need the history behind you, but then you need next is the up and coming leaders. So when you think about up and coming leaders, what does your community look like? Again, are there a few leaders that are doing everything? Because that often is the case. Or is it the case where you have, you know, the spokespersons that are doing a lot of the work, but then they're surrounded by new people that can pick it up if they're not available for whatever reason? And if you think about future leaders, take age out of the entire equation, because that has nothing to do with leadership or leadership development. I can say for sure in California, at least, a new leader could be somebody that's 60 years old. A new leader could be somebody that's 20 years old. A new leader could be somebody that's 15 years old. So you really have to take age out of the entire equation when you're talking about sustainability and you're talking about a transition plan. Perhaps you already have designated leaders ready to take the reins when it's time, but you just never know what's going to happen in this world, and you always have to have multiple people that can take on a role as necessary. So if you think about all the components and all of the people that need to be developed as future leaders to take over if transition needs to take place, also think about the elements of compliance. So leaders have a role in community speaking, but if you're going to think about a nonprofit organization for your tribe, or if you have a tribe that already has not a nonprofit status or other like legal structure in place, then there's always compliance that goes along with that. And so is your organization set up so that there are multiple streams of information that can be archived and secured in order to respond to any compliance requirements at any moment in time? And are they in a good place so that if there's a transition needs to take place, everybody knows where those documents are or how to access them? And sometimes they're not documents. Perhaps it's a person that you need to go to for particular pieces of information in order to respond to some kind of regulation or some kind of report that needs to take place. And think about the risks also involved if you don't have a compliance plan in place and some transparency around that plan. Number one, if you have nonprofit status, you could lose that nonprofit status. If you're receiving grants, then you could be risking that grant administration or future funds, or you could be required to pay back money that was given to you. So all of these things are really critical. So these are kind of some of the seeds that I'd like for you to think about. And then I won't talk a lot about donors or a donor plan, but just to say that in order to stay sustainable and in order to be functioning long-term, there should be a donor plan. And the donor plan is really like it has to be a strategic plan. So, you know, what are you doing this year to try and raise money? Are you looking at individual donors? Are you looking at fundraising events? All of that needs to be put in place. And then also messaging around your donor plan. You know, do you need to, you know, if you've applied for grants in the past, for example, and you've been denied again and again and again, is there anything that you can do to change that situation? And it could be sometimes the language that's in a particular grant, maybe new ways to describe the things that you're doing so that donors actually understand what you're doing. Or maybe it's maybe it means really looking at your messaging and the goals of the grant to make sure that there's alignment between the funder and the funding that's happening. Those are all things that I would say, if any of those things are like interesting, or any of those topics come to mind as I'm speaking, I would go ahead and add something in the chat, because we might not be able to cover all of this today, but it could be a topic for a future webcast. I know that for sure donor plan is something that we need to cover in the future to help people really align with, you know, the proper funders, and to really think about like the language in grant applications to make sure that the words we say as Indigenous people and write down are really communicated well, so other people understand what we're looking for, what we're asking for, and funding hopefully will become a little bit more consistent. Are we gonna wait for questions at the end, Maija? Or did you want to do them now at the end? Okay, so if you have any questions, I would also say go ahead and put them in the chat, because we could also scroll down and go over those questions. Thank you. Andy.
Okay, I have a question for you, Charlie. I really want, I'm gonna come out sort of left field for you here, but I really want to hear you talk at some point about integrating culturally identifiable practices into your nonprofit governance. Because I'm here, my little section here is on tips for compliance and sort of straight talk about nonprofit nuts and bolts. And but the piece that I find really fascinating is that, how do you really make it, if this is an Indigenous-led nonprofit, if it's expressing a leadership function for a nation or for something that's really important, how do you integrate those culturally identifiable practices and ways, your particular ways, whatever they happen to be in your nation, your people, your into that, into the structure of how you do things. And so anyway, I want you to think about that, Charlene, because we talk about this a lot, but I feel like I really want to hear your perspective on that. But that really is, I think, gets to the heart of what I'm talking about, because talking about compliance, it's important, and I don't want to downplay it, but at the same time, it's not the heart of what we're doing. Nonprofits are colonial structures, right? And we have to recognize what they are in order to be able to use them properly, so that they can actually perform the function that you want. And what the function of a nonprofit in this realm of Indigenous governance, Indigenous-led nonprofits is usually, from what I've heard and seen, has to do with an expression of sovereignty, and Indigenous sovereignty, Native sovereignty is something that's inherent, and it's something to do with what particular form you're using. But in this case, especially for unrecognized tribes, or for members of recognized tribes that don't want to enter into a particular situation in reliance on their tribal government, which is a political structure, also often based on colonized structures, you have the opportunity to choose a nonprofit corporation and a nonprofit structure as your vehicle for doing this. And the whole point is to recognize that as your vehicle. And the nonprofit corporation, the 501c3, whatever it is, probably a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, is a vehicle that you use to interface with other colonial structures, right? You kind of need it in order to express your sovereignty, because you can just go occupy some land and that might work, maybe. But if you can actually purchase the land and then own it in fee simple, and you have a nonprofit that owns the land, but you're a sovereign nation and you have this nonprofit and it's your vehicle, and you bring that fee simple title together with your original title that you have as the locals, that's really powerful. And that's a powerful expression of sovereignty. And that's recognized by, anyway, we could get into details about that, but you have the ability to do what you want for the most part there. And so in order to do that, you have to actually follow some of these rules and create the nonprofit and get into the compliance stuff. But we don't want the tail to wag the dog here. You know, we want to keep our eye on the ball, which is the expression of whatever it is you're trying to do. Let's call it sovereignty in this case. So, so nonprofit, you know, there's two modes or main modes when I think of compliance, nonprofit compliance. And, you know, the first is in your startup phase, and there's a lot to do in the startup phase. And the second is in your sort of annual and ongoing maintenance phase in a nonprofit. And look, as lawyers, you know, we see corporations and nonprofits, clients come into us all the time with business entities that are totally out of compliance, right? And yet they're oftentimes still doing business and still, you know, things are still working at some level, or maybe they're partly in compliance, partly not. But really, we want to do things well, and especially if we want to interface with funding opportunities, grants, different things like that. It's really good to have your compliance in order. And when I'm talking about compliance, like from startup standpoint, we're thinking about things like creating a nonprofit corporation under your state law, which is usually fairly simple to do as far as sending the paperwork to the state. But then you've got other things that go with that, like bylaws. And, you know, I used to, in my nonprofit practice, you know, had sort of stock bylaws that, you know, you say, here you go, your bylaws and blah, blah, blah. But then start thinking, actually, how do we create bylaws that reflect how we actually do things in our, you know, in our ways and how this is, and how do we do things in our nonprofit when we come together? You know, you got to have, maybe under state law, you have to have a president and a treasurer and a secretary or something like that. But it doesn't mean you can't call your president under a culturally recognizable name, you know, maybe a name in the language or something like that. And maybe the duties of the president can be more sitting, you know, in circle rather than presiding over or something like that. I mean, it really depends on what's happening in the situation. But so things like bylaws become important if you want them to actually reflect how you do things in your particular organization. So creating the nonprofit, setting up bylaws, having a board of directors, having your officers in place. But then again, how do you make decisions? So how do you make decisions amongst your board of directors? Do you use, you know, Robert's rules of procedure, like I move, I second, all in favor? Like, is that, you know, culturally identifiable? Is that how you want to do things in your nonprofit? So I like to think about these things and have the people involved in your organization to really think about how you want to do that. You know, maybe you want to employ a consensus process. You know, maybe you don't want to have a majority rules, or maybe, you know, only in an extreme circumstance. You know, if you're in an organization and you're deciding to do something over the objection of a significant component of your, you know, your membership of your people, something to take note of. So how do you actually make decisions, et cetera? Startup compliance, things like filing your 501c3 application and getting the 501c3 designation from the IRS if you want to do that, or do you want to work with another nonprofit that can be your fiscal sponsor, so you don't have to deal with that layer of compliance. Your state very well may have a charitable registry of some kind. You know, I know California's got one. I know Maine has one. I know there's a lot of nonprofits in Maine that aren't registered with the state, and nobody really cares, you know. So, but in California, they might, because they're a little stricter where they're in California. You know, and so things like those are some of the things we think about from a startup standpoint, and they're really good to think about. And all of these compliance things, they can be really, you know, you really cannot want to look at it, but they're all really simple. And for somebody that understands this stuff and knows how to do it, like you can appoint somebody in your organization to be the compliance, you know, guru or whatever. Like that's so that kind of startup compliance is important. And then coming to maintenance and ongoing compliance and growth, right? Because you may start up around a kitchen table with, 4 people, and you create a nonprofit, and then, a few years later, somebody's giving you a couple $1 million in property, and then you've got these grants, you got money coming in and out, and then all of a sudden you need more capacity, you need more people, maybe you need some employees, maybe you need, and so then maybe you need a policy, an employee handbook, things like that. And of course, to start a conflict of interest policies and, different other, I think about things like peacemaking policies, dispute resolution, how do you resolve disputes and how do you come together in a culturally identifiable way that works? Thinking about that from a proactive standpoint as part of your startup, and think about it as part of compliance. It's important to do. And then the annual maintenance kind of things like, one of the things we see a lot is nobody files the annual report with Secretary of State, and you get suspended, then you get administratively dissolved. And then, and then a couple of years later, you want to apply for a grant, and then they say, well, you don't actually exist anymore. It's like, oh, we don't exist. Okay. And so then you have to, resurrect it and do all this stuff and you pay, extra fees. Whereas if somebody was just filing the annual report, which literally takes 5 minutes, if you know where to log on and do it. But at the same time, every year you want to make sure that you know who is on your board of directors, and you know what their terms are, and you know who your officers are, and that your officers know that they're actually officers, and that people are all on the same page going forward. So that kind of annual compliance, growth compliance, thinking about things like, do we have the insurance that we need? Do we need insurance? Do we have a bookkeeper? Do we want a bookkeeper? Do we have somebody that's going to file our annual 990 with the IRS? Because that's another big one, that you stop filing the 990 because you're not really thinking about it. Maybe we didn't do much. And then all of a sudden you're kind of out of compliance. And are you still a 501c3? And there's not a whole lot of people paying attention to small nonprofits at the IRS, which is probably good for most of us that are involved in small nonprofits. But you really want to be crossing those T's and dotting those I's. But thinking about, as we come to the end of my little compliance section, where do organizations fail? Where do nonprofits like this fail? Usually it's not because they didn't cross a T or dot an I. Even if you get administratively dissolved, we can deal with that. Where they fail is in the kinds of things that Charlene was talking about earlier. We don't have a way to bring this forward. We don't have a transition plan. We don't have a way, or maybe there's people that are hanging on that don't really have the time and energy to do it. Maybe we're also colonized in the way we think, in our sort of adversarial approach to communication. We can't come together. We don't know how to actually make peace amongst ourselves to work as a team, work as a unit. Maybe we've been really decimated historically, and through genocide and all different kinds of things. And we're trying to recover from all of these, the things that have happened to ourselves and our people and our, and we need healing. And all these things get in the way of actually working together. So thinking about how we actually work together, come together and do things in a culturally identifiable way, really important things to think about. Compliance itself, yes, it's really important. At some level, it's not all that important, but it is important. So anyway, I'm gonna leave on that statement of clarity and pass it back to Maija West. Maija.
Hi, everybody. I'm just giggling over here with my mute button on. I think, I guess what I'll start with is just to say thank you to Charlene and Andy for your sharing your perspectives on governance. And I kind of see myself as a bridge builder between these, and a bridger between these two different worldviews, that of the Indigenous view and that of the non-Indigenous view, however people self-identify. And so how that looks in reality is, that I find myself in equal parts of my day spending time with those that are of Indigenous nations or identify as Indigenous leaders, and then state agencies, county staff, land trust employees, and I often get a lot of questions because of our work with in supporting Indigenous communities. What about this? What about that? And so when they're asking me those questions, they're doing their relationship due diligence. They're trying to figure out who's a good partner for them. And for those that come from recognized nations, this is pretty straightforward. It's very easy to understand who they're dealing with. Well, easier. There's tribal government, there's elected officials sometimes, there's a listing with the feds on the BIA website. And so those are sometimes give folks that confidence of being able to have a partner in work that they're going to do, and specifically related to land access, land return, land back. And the reason why we wanted to really focus on governance for our Indigenous nations and relations is because that's the first thing that we get asked is, do you know if that tribe is properly set up? Do you know if the leaders truly represent their members or not? Do you know if how do you go about doing this with somebody that's not a recognized nation? And so the nonprofit structure provides some of that protection to nations because it implies a formal process. But what I'm going to be speaking about today is the rights of the Indigenous nations to do their own relationship due diligence. In my roles during my day, I work a lot with non-Indigenous people who are wanting to be in right relations and be a good guest on the lands here. And they're wanting to be good people. They're wanting to be allies. They call them, self sometimes. What I've learned from working with white people specifically, and I've learned from my own work and healing my own lineage and line, which is an ongoing and lifelong practice, is that we forget things. We forget our relationships. We disassociate in the kindest possible way, sometimes from our responsibilities. In fact, we may never have learned about responsibilities. We were maybe just raised with rights. We have a right to this, right to that, but we are not necessarily taught what responsibility means. And many of you are familiar with this on a very personal and sometimes painful level. So I will leave it there. But how it shows up in these type of conversations is that leaders of nonprofits come and go all the time, and we don't always know what they are doing to take responsibility for the next leader who comes forward, who says they're going to work with a tribe, that they're also doing that in such a way with that responsibility to honor the generational responsibility that Charlene spoke of earlier. So it's totally acceptable for our Indigenous leaders and nations to do their own due diligence with their partners. And a few things that I'm going to recommend today. The first one is a big invitation to be selective right now. There has been a change that many of us are here and have witnessed in this last 2 years in particular of organizations being aware, maybe for the first time, of the needs and constituencies of the Indigenous peoples and their communities. And as they're in their own learning curve around that, there's a lot of folks scrambling to randomly pick an Indigenous person off the street to get on their board, to get into their speaking engagements, to do all those things. And maybe even be partners on a highly public, highly publicized project. And I invite our Indigenous leaders to be selective. And being selective for me includes asking the questions that you would expect of your own membership and your own nation, which is, what's your long-term commitment to our nation or our peoples? And how do you show that in your documentation? Is that a part of your strategic plan or not? That tells you a lot. Most larger nonprofits have a strategic plan that they adopt every more or less 5 years. And is there in the strategic plan, does it mention a high goal and objective to be focused on Indigenous engagement and meaningful tribal relationships or not? Or is this a one-off? Another thing that I would encourage our Indigenous leaders who are on this call today to ask is, does the board of directors know that we're talking? Do they know that we're having this conversation? Is this part of the board of directors guidance to you as a representative of your organization to have this conversation today? And then personally, I love to invite nations to invite those non-Indigenous partners to come to their council meetings so they can meet everybody on the council when it's appropriate to go through a formal process to come into the space of an Indigenous council meeting for decision making, for a proposal, for coming to and carrying the burden of putting the burden on the non-Indigenous partner to bring that proposal to the Indigenous Tribal Council. Andy brought up the history. And so being Latvian, I've had to work on my own intergenerational healing from displacement of my mother's people from Latvia and her boarding a camp and the challenges that came from some of the impacts of genocide and displacement from the war in Latvia and occupation till 1991. And as I worked through that in my own healing, I realized that one of my challenges from my family history was having a broken advocate button, a broken relationship button, picking bad boyfriends, bad friends. Maybe some of you guys can relate to this. Bad business partners. I had some challenges around selection of relationships because I just from my history just wasn't able to do that very well. And because of that trauma and my need for healing around that, it took me a while to learn how to be in good relationship and to pick right people to be in relationship with. And I'm still learning today. And so as I share that here, one of our resources today will be about a handout on advocates, knowing your advocates, how to pick an advocate. And I share that because of my own learning. And I invite you to share that when you're deciding who to be selective with your partners, that we don't have to do it by ourselves. And I kind of hinted at that a little bit when I talked about bringing decisions to a formal council or vote with a group of people, because sometimes we each need to help each other make that decision. And I've learned that as a mother that I'm not always good at parenting my daughter. But it comes from my other mothers in my life and grandmothers that help me see something in my child that I don't know and can't see myself. In the same way, when I'm picking people to be in relationship with, I try to bring someone with me. And I've learned that from Charlene, thankfully, and others who've invited me to bring someone along when I'm in a relationship building conversation. We know the issue is that there's a lot of folks trying to check the box right now about working with Indigenous folks. And we know that's harmful. We know that feels like a transaction and not a relationship. And so I just inviting you and us being selective, that now is a high time to develop your due diligence around that. Because at the end of the day, there is definitely urgency, as was shared from one of our members here. We needed this yesterday. And also we want to be selective so that those governance needs are met, that the sovereign cultural deepest desires and urges that are at your back right now are honored by strong long-term relationships, and that you have the right and the responsibility to do that well, so that those relationships that you bring into your circle are the right ones. And that each of us has that responsibility to do our best and to help each other do that well. And we welcome that pushing back also. They can also be invited to learn. My favorite last question before I close is you can ask them if they have done any diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Our sister nonprofit has a training for non-Indigenous people, and we developed that training because our Indigenous relations were saying we need a place to send our non-Indigenous partners to get some education before I talk to them, because everything that comes out of their mouth is hurting me. And I want to be in a relationship with them, but they literally are using language that I have a trauma response to, and I cannot deal with them. And I don't know how to have a relationship with someone who's hurting me with their ignorance, their lack of understanding, and their unskillfulness. And so they needed that. Sometimes there's a need for that additional education. And so I think it's totally acceptable to ask if their staff or those partners have had that education or training. Okay, finally, we also need help. And so inviting into relationship building when you picked relationship partners, inviting a third-party facilitator in to help. We were just listening to one of our leaders from an unrecognized nation here on the Central Coast area, that she had spent 30 hours in meetings with one state agency relationship, and still there was no resolution, and still the state agency employees were not listening. And it was causing her a lot of struggle, because she's doing in good faith, participating in a process that they laid out and said would lead to resolution, but it's not happening. And so in cases like that, where you already have found yourself in a relationship that's maybe not moving in the way you thought it would, or you're putting too much energy and time into that relationship, then sometimes having third-party support through a facilitator, mediator, peacemaker can be of assistance. And that's always a good step to helping get resolution, and when it's the right fit. Okay. We are going to spend a few minutes going over a couple of resources. For some of you that are listening, we invite you to stay. We hope you can stay. We're going to go into questions and answers now, and we're going to invite us all to kind of come together. We're going to turn the recording off. But before we do, I'll just share just the slide on peacemaking. When we're talking about it, we're talking about core values and resolving conflict through kind of a commitment to healing informed communication, and sometimes third-party peacemakers. We'll go over a couple of resources, and then for those of you who attended today, we're going to send you some handouts that we've mentioned, these slides, so you have this information before we close. And it's been a pleasure to get to be with you today and to provide our perspective and where we're at with our own learning and those topics. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, we'll invite Hajar to go ahead and turn off the recording.